2 digits. That's all it took to end a political war that had been brewing inside USA basketball for over a year. Number 22. No negotiation with the veterans, no survey of the locker room, no committee meeting where the old guard got to weigh in. The coaching staff made the call, handed Caitlin Clark her jersey, and in doing so sent a message to every single person inside that program that required absolutely no translation. And what most people covering this story are completely missing is that the coaching staff didn't make that decision alone. There was a corporate signature attached to it, one that carries more weight in professional sports than any seniority system ever could. This isn't just a story about a jersey number. This is a story about power, money, and what happens when an institution tries to humble someone who turns out to be unhumbleable. Stick with us, because this one runs deeper than anything you've seen covered elsewhere, and we're just getting started. To understand what that number means today, you have to go back to the moment the fracture first appeared. When the Paris Olympic roster was announced and Caitlin Clark's name wasn't on it, the people running USA basketball came prepared with explanations. They talked about chemistry. They talked about the physicality of international competition. They referenced the importance of fitting into an established system, the value of experience on the biggest stages, the idea that even the most talented players sometimes need to wait their turn. On the surface, if you didn't look too closely, those reasons sounded almost reasonable. Almost. Because sources close to the program have since confirmed what a significant portion of the basketball world already suspected. The real calculation happening behind those closed doors had very little to do with basketball. The old guard inside that program wanted to send a message, a clear one. Cultural popularity, they believed, doesn't automatically purchase influence at the elite level. The thinking was straightforward, even if it wasn't something anyone was willing to say out loud at the time. Show the league's new face that the establishment still controls access. Make her wait. Recalibrate the power dynamic before it shifts too far in a direction that makes the veterans uncomfortable. Demonstrate that seniority still governs the room, regardless of how many casual fans suddenly know your name. The goal, when you strip away all the basketball language, was to humble her. And what happened next became one of the most spectacular institutional backfires in recent sports memory, not just in women's basketball, in sports, period. While Team USA was in Paris collecting gold medals in front of crowds that looked more like Tuesday night preseason games than Olympic competition, Caitlin Clark was back home doing something the women's game had genuinely never witnessed at this scale. She was selling out WNBA arenas in cities where the local team had never once come close to a sellout. She was driving television viewership numbers that didn't just break the league's historical records, they shattered the ceiling so completely that analysts had to go back and reconsider their entire framework for what women's basketball could generate commercially. Merchandise was moving faster than supply chains could physically restock it. Casual fans, people who had never once cleared a calendar for a women's basketball game in their lives, were suddenly rearranging their entire schedules around the Indiana Fever. The cultural shift wasn't gradual, it wasn't slow building, it was immediate, and it was massive, and it was impossible to look away from. The numbers tell that story better than anything else. WNBA viewership during the 2024 season hit levels the league had never come close to in its entire history. Games featuring the Indiana Fever were drawing audiences that dwarfed not just WNBA records, but benchmarks that most sports media analysts had written off as permanently out of reach for women's professional basketball. The Fever became the most watched team in the league by a margin that wasn't even competitive. Road games in opposing arenas drew Clark-driven crowds that made home fans outnumber the locals. Think about what that means. Fans were traveling to opposing cities just to watch her play. In a league where road attendance had historically been an afterthought, Clark was turning away games into cultural events. The merchandise numbers were equally staggering. Her jersey moved at a pace that hadn't been seen at the WNBA level and that competed directly with the top-selling jerseys across men's professional sports. Retailers couldn't keep product on shelves. The supply chain, which had never been built to handle demand at this scale for a women's basketball player, was visibly struggling to keep up. USA Basketball was watching all of it unfold in real time from across the Atlantic, and the people running the program's financial models, the ones responsible for sponsorship revenue, broadcast partnerships, and long-term commercial viability, were forced into a conversation that nobody in the institution wanted to have publicly. This wasn't just a cultural miscalculation, it was a financial one. And in professional sports, at every level and in every organization, nothing gets corrected faster than a financial mistake. Nothing. The conversation that followed the Paris Games, according to sources familiar with the internal dynamic, was not a warm invitation extended from a position of institutional confidence. It was not a tap on the shoulder from an organization that felt it had made the right call and simply wanted to move forward graciously. It was a negotiation, a real one. And Caitlin Clark walked into it holding every meaningful chip on the table. She had the audience, she had the cultural momentum that the program desperately needed to make the 2028 Los Angeles Olympics the kind of event that justifies the investment being made around it. She had a rookie season that had statistically dismantled, point by point, every single argument that had been used to justify leaving her off the Paris roster in the first place. She led the Fever in assists, she dragged a franchise that entered the year projected for lottery territory into postseason basketball on basketball IQ, competitive will, and a passing range that opposing defenses simply had no clean answer for. Every metric, every highlight, every filled arena pointed in exactly the same direction. The case against her readiness for elite competition was not just weakened, it had been archived, sealed, and filed away where it could never be credibly reopened. And on top of all of that, she brought one additional piece of leverage into that room. One that the basketball conversation keeps dramatically underplaying, even though it may be the single most decisive factor in everything that has happened since. And that factor has a logo on it. Nike's investment in Caitlin Clark, by every credible report that has come out of the sports business world, represents one of the most significant athlete endorsement commitments in the history of women's sports. The exact numbers aren't publicly confirmed in full, but the scale of the brand architecture Nike has built around her makes the investment impossible to minimize. Reports have placed the value of her Nike deal in territory that puts it among the most lucrative endorsement arrangements any female athlete has ever signed. And when you look at what Nike has actually built around her name, the number becomes easier to believe. Global marketing campaigns running simultaneously across multiple continents, retail programs operating in dozens of markets, a merchandise ecosystem that, by most estimates from sports business analysts, is functioning at 9-figure scale annually. Signature products at multiple price points designed to capture every segment of a consumer base that didn't exist at this size 3 years ago. Brand identity infrastructure that took years of planning, enormous capital investment, and a serious long-term bet on a single athlete's ability to sustain and grow her cultural footprint. And at the center of all of it, embedded into the logo itself, stitched into every piece of merchandise that carries her name and image, printed on every campaign that runs in every market, is a specific number, number 22. That number is not Caitlin Clark's preference the way some athletes prefer a lucky number. It is her registered brand identity. It is the number that was attached to her name when she was at Iowa, rewriting the NCAA scoring record and placing women's college basketball on a completely different cultural planet. It is the number that Nike's design team spent months incorporating into visual identity systems. It is the number that Nike's marketing team built campaign architecture around. It is the number that Nike's global retail operation embedded into product lines that ship to dozens of countries. When a corporation of Nike's size and financial sophistication makes that kind of investment in a single athlete, when that number is woven into campaigns reaching audiences in markets across the world, it creates a situation where putting that athlete on the world's biggest stage in a different number makes exactly zero business sense. Zero. The financial logic of maintaining number 22 across every context where Caitlin Clark appears publicly is so airtight that the conversation inside USA Basketball probably wasn't particularly long. The people with a 9-figure financial stake in that specific number made sure it traveled with her. That is not speculation. That is not a conspiracy theory. That is simply how corporate sports partnerships function when the investment is large enough to matter to people whose entire job is protecting it.
The coaching staff confirmed the number, but make no mistake about who was in the room when the actual decision was made and whose interests shaped the outcome. Nike's broader strategic play here is worth understanding because it reframes the entire jersey conversation. The company has been watching the growth curve of women's basketball with the same analytical intensity it applies to any market it has decided to dominate. The WNBA's commercial expansion over the last 2 years has been the kind of growth story that changes how major corporations allocate resources. When viewership triples, when merchandise demand outpaces supply, when a single player is driving those numbers at a scale nobody projected, the organizations with financial exposure to that player's brand do not sit quietly and hope the relevant decision makers in sports governance make the right call. They participate. They make their position known through the channels available to entities of their size and influence. And the result of that participation is a number 22 jersey hanging in a Team USA locker room, ready for the largest women's basketball stage the world has ever assembled. Now here is what makes that jersey confirmation so politically loaded inside that locker room. Because while the business logic is airtight from the outside, the people living inside that environment every day are not running financial models. They are athletes, competitors, people who built their careers on a very specific understanding of how respect and recognition are earned inside elite programs. Inside that Team USA locker room right now, there are players who spent a decade grinding through overseas leagues in countries most casual fans couldn't locate on a map, fighting for roster spots that paid a fraction of what their talent was worth, winning gold medals in arenas that barely covered their own operating costs. They did everything the program asked them to do. They accepted the timeline the program set. They respected the seniority system because they believed, reasonably, that the system would eventually respect them back. And then they watched a player in her second professional year walk through the door and receive, in a single administrative decision, what 10 years of service historically purchases inside programs like this one.
Let's be specific about what that friction looks like in practice, because vague references to locker room tension don't capture the reality of what has been playing out. The hard fouls. During Clark's rookie WNBA season, she absorbed physical contact at a rate and intensity that prompted serious conversation among officials, analysts, and fans about where the line between competitive defense and something more deliberate actually sat. Several incidents went beyond what the game's unwritten rules typically permit against a rookie. Veteran players with reputations for physical defense were suddenly applying that physicality almost exclusively in Clark's direction. The pattern was consistent enough and specific enough that it couldn't be dismissed as coincidence. The camera moments. Television broadcasts of WNBA games are sophisticated enough now that the secondary camera coverage catches what was previously invisible to audiences. Reactions on the bench, expressions between teammates during timeouts, the moments between plays when the competitive mask slips and something more unfiltered comes through. Some of what those cameras caught during Clark's rookie season was the kind of material that clip accounts spent weeks analyzing. None of it was flattering to the idea that the transition was going smoothly behind the scenes. The media comments. Specific veterans with enough profile and credibility to make their words land with weight chose podcast appearances and media availability sessions to raise what they framed as analytical questions about Clark's impact. Were her numbers a product of genuine elite skill or a reflection of a system designed to maximize her visibility? Was the cultural attention she was receiving proportional to her actual basketball contribution or inflated by factors that had nothing to do with what she was doing on the court? These weren't questions asked in the abstract. They were asked by people with names, with histories inside the program, with credibility earned over years of elite competition. And they were asked in the specific window when the Paris exclusion debate was freshest and the institutional power balance was most unsettled. None of those signals were accidents. None of them were misread, and none of them disappear with a jersey number assignment, no matter how loaded that assignment is symbolically. But here is the thing. The coaching staff confirmed the number publicly anyway. That confirmation is its own message, a clear one.
It tells you precisely what conversations have already taken place behind closed doors, and it tells you exactly where those conversations landed. A line has been drawn. The program has communicated in the clearest possible terms which direction it is heading between now and 2028. Get on board or get left behind. And the statistical argument for getting on board is one that nobody inside that locker room, regardless of their personal feelings, can honestly argue against. Here is where the media's role in all of this deserves its own honest accounting, because the press coverage surrounding Caitlin Clark over the last 2 years has not been a neutral mirror held up to events as they unfolded. It has been an active participant in shaping the narrative, and not always in ways that reflected what the evidence actually supported. When Clark was putting up numbers at Iowa that no player in the history of college basketball, men's or women's, had ever matched, a significant segment of the sports media infrastructure responded not with straightforward coverage of an historic achievement, but with a sustained effort to contextualize, qualify, and in some cases actively minimize what was happening. The competition-level arguments, the conference strength debates, the suggestion that her numbers were inflated by a system designed around her strengths in ways that wouldn't translate to the professional level. All of it was presented as analytical rigor, and some of it, in isolation, represented legitimate basketball conversation. But the volume of it, the consistency of it, the specific framing choices that kept appearing across outlets that don't typically coordinate their coverage, told a different story. There was an institutional discomfort with what Clark represented. A player who didn't fit the existing template for what women's basketball stardom was supposed to look like was generating attention that threatened to reorganize the entire cultural hierarchy of the sport. And segments of the media ecosystem that had built their credibility around the existing hierarchy had a vested interest in slowing that reorganization down. The Paris exclusion coverage was the most revealing moment in that entire dynamic. When the roster was announced without Clark's name, the mainstream sports media largely accepted and amplified the official explanations: chemistry, experience, system fit. Very few outlets pressed hard on the financial and political subtext that sources closer to the situation were already describing in detail. The questions that should have been front and center about what Clark's omission meant for the program's commercial trajectory, about the power dynamics between established veterans and a player whose cultural footprint was already larger than any of theirs, about who specifically was driving the exclusion and what their motivations actually were, those questions were largely left unasked. And then the season happened, and the numbers came in, and the arenas filled up, and the merchandise sold out, and the same outlets that had spent months carefully managing the narrative around Clark's readiness found themselves in the awkward position of having to cover a story that had comprehensively answered every question they had been raising. The recalibration has been visible in real time. The tone has shifted, the framing has changed, but the credibility cost of the original coverage remains, and it belongs to the specific voices that chose to spend a year questioning something the evidence was already answering. Those voices have a front-row seat now. The story they helped shape has been replaced by a different one, and the jersey hanging in that locker room is the proof.
Clark led the Indiana Fever in assists during her rookie season. She broke records that analysts had genuinely assumed would stand for years. She took a franchise operating at the bottom of the league's competitive spectrum and pulled it into postseason basketball through a combination of basketball IQ, relentless competitive intensity, and a passing range that created problems defenses encountered no reliable solution for. But let's go deeper than the headline numbers, because the headline numbers only tell part of the story. Clark's ability to function as a primary playmaker at the WNBA level as a rookie was, by any honest historical measure, extraordinary. Point guards typically require multiple seasons to develop the court vision, defensive read recognition, and positional decision-making that Clark was displaying consistently from the opening weeks of her first professional season. The processing speed, the ability to identify where the defense is vulnerable before the play develops and to deliver the ball to the right spot at the right moment with the right pace, that is a skill that veteran players spend years developing. Clark arrived with it essentially fully formed. Her shooting range created a different kind of problem for opposing defenses. When a player can credibly threaten the basket from distances that most defenders have been trained not to respect, the entire defensive structure of the opposing team has to adjust. Help rotations that normally function reliably break down. Closeouts that would be automatic against most players become dangerous gambles against someone with Clark's release speed and consistency from range. Defenses that committed to stopping her passing opened up driving lanes. Defenses that committed to stopping her driving opened up the three-point line. There was no clean answer. There still isn't one. The argument about whether she belongs at the elite international level is not just settled. It has been settled, documented, analyzed, and put away. It is no longer a conversation that serious basketball people are willing to have in public. The 2028 Los Angeles Olympics represent the largest stage women's basketball has ever had access to on American soil. The coaching staff is not building a roster around legacy or rewarding seniority for its own sake. They are building around what produces the most dominant possible result in front of the biggest possible audience. And the player they have chosen to center their offensive architecture around creates structural problems for opposing teams that no scheme has reliably solved. Put Clark at the point of a Team USA offense. Surround her with A'ja Wilson, who is arguably the most dominant post presence in the international game at this moment, and Breanna Stewart, one of the most versatile forwards the global game has ever seen. Clark reading defensive coverage at the top of the key, identifying the mismatch, and delivering the ball to Wilson or Stewart in exactly the right position to do damage is not just a basketball team, it is a systemic problem. It is the kind of offensive construction that opposing coaching staffs lose sleep over because there is no clean defensive answer for it. Every adjustment you make to contain Clark opens something up for Wilson or Stewart. Every resource you commit to slowing down Wilson or Stewart leaves Clark with space to operate that she will punish without hesitation. The talent around Clark makes her better, and Clark's presence makes the talent around her dramatically more dangerous. That combination, on home soil in front of the largest women's basketball audience ever assembled, is what the program is now building toward, and what it produces in Los Angeles could be the defining moment in the history of the women's game. Students of the game have watched a transition like this one before. When the Dream Team era shifted generationally from Magic Johnson and Larry Bird to Michael Jordan, it was not a smooth process. There were egos involved. There was real friction, competitive pride colliding hard against the undeniable direction the game was moving. Players who had defined an era struggling with the reality that a new era had already begun, whether they were ready to accept it or not. Veterans who had earned everything the sport had to offer, finding it genuinely difficult to process the idea that someone else was now the gravitational center of the enterprise they had given their careers to. That friction was real. It was uncomfortable. It played out in ways that weren't always visible to the public, but were absolutely felt by everyone inside those programs. But it was necessary. It was the price of the transition. And what emerged from the other side of it was the most dominant, sustained run in the history of basketball. The women's game is living through its own version of that exact moment right now. The circumstances are different. The sport is different. The specific pressures and dynamics are different, but the fundamental structure of what is happening, a generational transition that the old guard didn't choose and didn't control, playing out in real time with all the friction and resistance that such transitions always produce, is exactly the same. And like every generational transition before it, this one will be judged not by how comfortable the process was, but by what it ultimately produces on the other side.
The number on that jersey is the flag planted in the ground, the formal institutional declaration that the era has changed hands.
Every voice that spent the last year filling podcast episodes and comment sections, publicly minimizing Clark's legitimacy, including the names that were specific and deliberate enough to put their actual credibility on the line, now has a front row seat to the answer they were given. The same media infrastructure that spent 12 months carefully constructing the narrative, questioning whether she was really that important, now watches number 22 get positioned globally as the symbol of American basketball's future. That is not a small irony. That is a complete institutional reversal. And everyone who participated in building the other narrative is going to have to live with it publicly, in a sport that has a very long memory for who said what and when. The pressure Clark carries into this role is real, and anyone telling you otherwise is not being straight with you. If Team USA struggles at any point between now and the podium in Los Angeles, the narrative machine will not hesitate. It will move fast and it will move hard. The same infrastructure that questioned her on the way up will be ready to declare her overrated on the way down. That is the reality of occupying the position she now holds. But the tape on Caitlin Clark performing under pressure has returned the same result at every level of this sport, from high school through the most scrutinized rookie season women's basketball has ever produced. The bigger the moment, the sharper the focus. She does not shrink under pressure. She expands. She has been the primary focal point of every program she has ever played in, and that pattern has never once broken regardless of the stakes, the scrutiny, or the specific nature of the opposition in front of her. A player who was told to wait, who was told the establishment would determine her timeline, forced the entire institution to move on her schedule instead. She did it in a single year, without a seat at the table, without institutional support, without the endorsement of the veterans whose approval the system told her she needed to earn first. She did it by filling arenas, breaking records, and producing a rookie season that made every argument against her look not just wrong, but embarrassing in retrospect. The number she wore at Iowa, the number Nike built a 9-figure brand ecosystem around, the number that just ended a political war inside USA basketball. That is the number that will represent this country on the world stage when the eyes of the sports world turn to Los Angeles in 2028. The critics have gone quiet. The doubters are recalibrating. The institutional bet has been placed publicly and officially. And if the last year taught us anything at all, it taught us this. Betting against Caitlin Clark is the worst investment anyone in this sport has ever made. The establishment tried to write her out of the story. Instead, she became the story. And in 2028, in front of the biggest audience women's basketball has ever had, she is going to finish it.